Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, you have part 4 of my SCASL project. In this video, I am going to wrap up the middle grade list. I'm going to save my overall thoughts for a final video, but that being said, I have read all of the middle grade books, which I am way ahead of schedule, way ahead of where I was last year with this list. And then I'm going to talk about the young adult list. I just glanced down because I don't have 4 of the books physically and realized I have 3 young adult books to talk about. That's my bad, because if you think about the math, I've been doing them in chunks of 8 and there's 20 on the list. And so 8 plus 8 is 16, and then there's 4 more. So, and then I had the one that I had already read. Anyway, I have 3 middle grade books to talk about. Yes, I still have finished the list. So let's talk about the middle grade before I talk briefly about something on the young adult list that I alluded to in a previous video that deals with one of the books that I'm going to talk about today. So of the middle grade books that I have to discuss, 2 of them were 4 stars and 1 was 4.5. So going in order from least liked to most liked, knowing that all of them were liked, let's start with Where the Sky Lives. So in Where the Sky Lives, you have a main character. Her name is Tuesday. The author never says whether or not she's neurodivergent, but it's almost glaringly obvious from some of the things that she does that she is. She has a fairly unconventional upbringing because I believe her mom used a sperm donor or IVF or something like that. So she doesn't have a father in the picture, but for a very long time in her life, her uncle, her mother's brother, was that father figure for her. Just before this book starts, he has passed away from some sort of illness. The exact illness is never mentioned. And so both Tuesday and her mother are dealing with grief in their own way. Another part of her unconventional upbringing is that her mother is an archaeologist. She works for the National Park Service at Zion National Park. Again, the dehumidifier. That was one of the best parts of this book, looking at different aspects of Zion National Park. One of the inciting incidents is the fact that there is a developer coming in to work on some of the land that has recently been sold that's close to the park. And they're dealing with issues like light pollution and I forget the exact term, but it's a term that describes something about this area being completely undisturbed by humans ever. And Tuesday is really passionate about this. So that's the main driving force of the novel. What brought it down a little bit for me was how didactic some of it seemed. And part of that has to do with Tuesday as a character. I believe she is neurodivergent in some way, and she sees things pretty much black and white, and she'll tell and she'll describe, but it almost seems like she's reciting off facts. While reading this, I tried to put myself in the mindset of a middle schooler reading this book, and even keeping in mind that this is her personality, this is how she sees the world and interacts with people, I just think that it would be a little off-putting for a middle school student. They're like, I don't want to read a science book, I wanted to read a novel. That being said though, I think that the author did a lot of good things with this novel and dealing with grief and change for Tuesday. Then we come to the other 4-star read that I have, and that is Meet Me Halfway by Annika Fajardo. In this, you have a situation where 2 sisters are being brought together. It's a similar but nowhere near the same situation as Clap When You Land, which is brilliant. This one, however, everything felt obvious and too easy. The way that one of the sisters knew about the other, knew why the dad had left. They both know of their dad. The dad's not been in either of their lives. But when they come together, it's almost like, oh wow, you have a twin. And you're supposed to not think that, oh, maybe they're actually related. That's a reveal that comes a lot later in the story than you would think. It seems really obvious. It also feels fairly simplistic. It did deal with a lot of obviously difficult issues, like why did the dad act the way that he did? Why did he abandon the first girl, the one who knew about the sister, why did he abandon the sister? It's a lot of deep issues and the potential is there. It just didn't rise to something all that compelling. So it was good, but not great. The middle grade book that I loved the most out of this set of 3 is What Happened to Rachel Riley. And if you have seen part 3 in my SCASL project, when I was describing those kids from Fawn Creek, I kept mixing up What Happened to Rachel Riley with that. I'm not exactly sure why. What Happened to Rachel Riley is so much better. And it's told in the style of A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. At least what I've heard, because I haven't read that book yet. There's mixed media. She's investigating. She's in 8th grade. She's new to town. She discovers that there's this girl who's present in school, but no one talks to her. No one talks about her. And when she's ever mentioned, people say really nasty things, or they ignore the new girl who's asking these questions. They don't explain anything, actually. And in one of her classes, it's an elective, all the students have to choose something to do a project, some sort of research investigation on, and she chooses this girl, Rachel Riley. And even the teacher is trying to discourage her from that. It was really compelling to figure out why did this incident that happened just a year before, not even a year before, I think like half a year before, completely change this whole town, adults, kids, etc. And I was a little bit nervous. I'm like, is it going to be something where it's worthy of this, oh, we never talk about her, we never mention her name sort of thing? And I think that the author did a really good job with this, created a scenario which was believable enough that it did not stretch the suspension of disbelief too far. I won't get into what it was that obviously that ostracized Rachel Riley, because that's the point of the whole book, but I think she did a really good job. And the way that some of the people handled the incident, the situation, made me so bad. But I know that people actually do that. And I think that the author did a really good job tackling this at a middle school level and showing students acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable. I think the author did a really good job. I'm trying to be very careful and not give away anything. Okay, so before I get into the 5 young adult books that I'm going to talk about, I want to talk about one of them. I think it was 2 videos ago. I mentioned something that I learned from the media center at my school, my old school. Made me so mad. So when I saw this particular book on the list, that was one of the things that made me think SCASL, the committee, went out of their way to choose really strong, really diverse books after what our state superintendent of education has done. It's like separating from the organization, and I'm going to not say anything else about that just because I have to be careful because I do work for the school system. This is the book, The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School. And I thought, okay, well, I'm actually going to read it. I didn't read it when it was on the Goodreads Choice Awards list 2022 because I didn't read just the regular fiction category. But I went down to the library. So the day before, I'd been going through the list, trying to make sure I had placed holds on the books that I needed and etc. And I saw one on there and I went, wait a second. I didn't talk about that one in part 1 where I went over all the books that I had read already, and I've already read that one. Has that one been on there this whole time? And I couldn't remember that. And so I asked about that. I asked about a book being switched out, thinking it was that one. It was Abuela Don't Forget Me by Rex Ogle. And I asked about it. They said something about, yeah, a book was switched out. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so I asked, was it Abuela Don't Forget Me? And they said, no. Well, what book was that? And I looked at the list because they sort of had a look on their face. And I looked because they had on the wall the covers of all of the young adult books. And I saw one on there and I was like, oh, that's a fantastic book. And it's An Arrow to the Moon by Emily X. Arpan, one that I've already read and really enjoyed. And I was like, well, what book did they switch it out with? So here's the situation. This book is still on the official list for the whole state. But all of the librarians in my district, they looked at this and they said, if we promote this, we're going to have people challenging this book simply based on the title of this book, which is absurd. And so maybe if we don't promote this book, we still have it available in the library, maybe we will be able to keep it in the library by not bringing it to attention. One of the librarians, the one that I was talking to, she said she was going to a meeting later that afternoon for, like, she's on a challenge committee. And I don't know how often they meet. I wish I had asked her about that and gotten a little bit more information. But whenever a book is challenged in the district, there's a committee. It's usually, as far as I know, it always has to have a librarian on the committee. And I think it's 3 people, but I don't know who makes up the other 2. When she said something about the challenges, I went, yeah, they probably haven't even read it. And she nodded along with it and said there is a question on the challenge form that asks if they have read the book. And she said that every single one that she's attended, every single one of these meetings that she's attended, the person has said no. They have not read the book. They've read excerpts. They've read the book looks provided by Moms for Liberty. That's not how you evaluate a book. You do not pull something out of context and say, this makes it glaringly inappropriate. That's not how critical thinking, critical literary analysis works. As an English teacher, like, no, that's not how that works. And so I went ahead and I read this book because obviously I've already read An Arrow to the Moon, so I wouldn't have had to add anything otherwise, but I'll talk about this one in just a moment. I want to be very careful, but also very clear in where I stand on making literature available to students, teaching them how to read discerningly and understand more. That's the side that I err on. In order of how I preferred them, I'm actually not going to start with Abuela Don't Forget Me, but that is one that I don't have a physical copy of. And I tried to get a physical copy of it from my library, the county library, but the county library has only a digital copy of it. I read it first as an ARC on NetGalley, but I'll get to that in a moment. So all of these are 4 stars or above. The 2 that I'm going to talk about next are 4 stars. If I remember correctly, I think Abuela Don't Forget Me got a 4.5 stars or a very high 4 stars. Then The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School got a 4.5 stars, and Ain't Burned All the Bright got a 5 stars. That's the last one I'll talk about in this video. So let's start off by talking about the one that I enjoyed the least. I enjoyed it, but it's the least out of the 5 to talk about here. And that is Daughters of a Dead Empire. So this is historical fiction. This is probably the one that I would say has the least representation, but it does have an appeal to it because this is set just after the death of the Romanov, the royal Romanov family, and in the heights and the turmoil of the Russian Revolution. It's a dual perspective. I should have realized this when I read the synopsis. One of the characters, one of the perspectives is Anastasia. Now, it has been proven historically, forensically, etc., that contrary to what a lot of people hoped, Anastasia did not escape. She was killed with her family. But there's a lot of stories based on the fact that she survived. One of my favorite animated movies. You know, I love that movie. I love Bartok. But that's besides the point. So the author acknowledges that in there. This is a what if sort of story. And it's got a dual perspective. You've got Anastasia on one side and you've got Yevgenia on the other. She's a peasant. She is fully immersed. She's a Bolshevik party member. And through circumstances, they are brought together. And this is a story, a what if story based on some historical events. This was fine. This type of story has been in a lot, so it didn't have any new, intriguing things to bring to the table. It was good. It was above some of the other books that I have read for this challenge, both middle grade and young adult, hence the 4 stars. I also think the appeal would not necessarily be there for certain groups because they're white, they're Russian, etc. But for some groups, there would be because of the idea of Anastasia or Anastasia. The next one that was actually my first read of June. It was the first book that I used for the amazing readathon, and that is Lawless Spaces. So this book is written in poetry. The main character, she has just turned 15, I believe, and her mother gives her a journal. And this is something that has been done for generations in her family, at least 4 or 5 generations. Upon their 15th or 16th birthday, they're given a journal, they write in it, etc. The thing that stretched the suspension of disbelief for me was that every single one of them wrote in poetry. I can get 1 or 2 of them, but all of them, setting that aside, however, she's dealing with a lot. Her mom was famous and then becomes sort of infamous because she comes forward with allegations against someone in the industry who's very powerful, and they're having to navigate all of these different things throughout life. I thought it was really well done, really impactful. I enjoyed this one more than the arc that I read before, The Widely Unknown Myth of Dorothy and Apple. Took a second for me to remember that. This, I think, worked really well. There just were a few things that kept me from wholeheartedly buying into the story, hence a 4-star and not a 4.5. This is definitely one that I would recommend, but I would be very mindful of a lot of the issues that are discussed in here, and I would get to know my student before I recommended the book. But again, that's one of the reasons why I don't put books on my classroom shelves unless I have read them. Appeal-wise, I think this would appeal. They might be off-put at first due to the length, but once they discover that it's written in poetry, poetic prose, I guess you would say, it's much more manageable for them. And next we have the one that I don't have a physical copy of, and that is Abuela Don't Forget Me by Rex Ogle. This one really surprised me. I was nervous going into it because I have read another one of his memoirs before, and that one felt like it was just digging in with all of the trauma over and over and over again. I felt heartbroken for Rex Ogle because it's a series of memoirs, but at the same time it just felt like too much. However, in Abuela Don't Forget Me, this one was such a tearjerker and so heartfelt. This book he dedicates to his grandma, who is suffering from dementia and thus losing a lot of her memories. And growing up, she was the stable figure in his life. He knew that he could rely on her when things got tumultuous and all topsy-turvy at home. And this is written like a love letter to his grandma. Not romantic love, but familial love. And it's so well done. I could not believe that, I think I rated School Lunch, which was the one that I didn't like a 2-star, but this one was a 4.5 star. It was so good. This is definitely one that I would keep on my shelves, especially at the school that I am going to for this upcoming year. And I was a little confused as to why it was on the young adult list and not the middle grade list. I think it's just because of the age that he was, the time in his life. It is mainly in his high school years, but it talks about a large expanse of time. So I think it was well done. Then we have the Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School. I think the title gives off the idea that more is going to be talked about based in the school itself. This is a life story. This is a coming of age. This is dealing with familial pressures and expectations. This one definitely has trigger warnings, content warnings. I would think about, I would need to get to know my students before I recommended this, because I wouldn't ever want to set them back. There's a situation in here that at one point her brother is really, really struggling. And an incident happens that puts everything into perspective for the entire family. And I won't go any further on that, but that was just, it was heartbreaking because he's the kind of guy, and she mentions throughout the book that anytime she would try to get serious with him, he would just joke and laugh it off and change the subject. But it was really masking this severe inner trauma that he was dealing with and just not talking about. And that's very prevalent in the Latina culture. And there's just so much that can be learned and gleaned throughout this book. It deals with a lot of stuff. Was I necessarily a fan of the romance part of it? No, that's just not for me. I think though that the author did a really good job in talking about the difficulties that students like this, both her and her brother, face in certain situations where there's so much pressure on them from all sides, where they think if they are truly themselves, they will lose their entire home life. They will be kicked out. They'll be on the street. They'll have to fend for themselves. So I think this was well done, but it definitely has content warnings. The last one was one that I knew just by looking at who the author was, that I would more than likely give this a 5 stars. And indeed I did. This is a very unique format that I think is so powerful. This is Ain't Burned All the Bright by Jason Reynolds, artwork by Jason Griffin. He's basically a co-author because so much of this, the whole story, is told with the artwork and with the text. So you see here, you've got some words on the page and you have artwork. I'm not going to show any more than that. This did not take me long to read, but there were certain points that were so incredibly powerful. It's just telling the story of an afternoon and just different thoughts that the main character has dealing with. It's set in during the pandemic. It's not stated explicitly, but I believe that his dad is sick with COVID. They're dealing with that as a family. How do they survive? How do they muddle through? This is also during the times of the protests after the murder of George Floyd. And the book is just, it's short, but so powerful. And the way that these two men were able to weave the words and the art together, the words alone are incredibly powerful. But pairing that with the artwork, stunning. And in the author's note, Jason Reynolds talks about, it's like a conversation between the two of them. And he mentions that he gave the words to Griffin, and Griffin chose how many words to have on these different pages and the images to go with it. And I have never read a book like that before, and this is just incredible. I think that one might be probably my number 1 on the list, but I've read so many good ones so far, as you saw in part 1 of this project. I'm going to hold up some of the other books that I haven't talked about yet, so you have an idea of the number of books that I've read for this part. In the next part, I believe I'll be talking about the last set of books. We have one more part to talk about books, and then the final part to talk about my thoughts overall on the list. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.